I'm delighted to welcome two of my best friends. I was recalling this morning that with Professor Panagariya, Arvind Panagariya, I will introduce him in a moment. We go back at least to 1993, so it's 20 years. And with Professor Bhagwati, we go back since the time I became an assistant professor here in 1973, some time ago. So it's, and today is, this year is 2013. So you see, it's for me double reason for celebration, and also it's a celebration. It's something very special. The three of us are in the same at the campus at the same time. Which is very unusual.
Even Jan is here.
Even Jan is here, that's right. This must be a very special day, and it is, indeed. Let me say a few words about my friends. Although, as they say, this is a case, extreme case of people who don't need an introduction. In fact, I should ask them to introduce me. But my role is to say a few words about that, about them. Let me say about the topic. Obviously, I don't need to advertise it. It's very central to the discussion in growth, been going on for forever, it seems. And Arvind has been working on this, on a book that one day will see the light of day. But it seems to be improving, as he told me, as even as it is not being produced as yet, given that there is a lot of new evidence that supports his view. But what's really impressive, and I must say it, and you will verify it very shortly, is how balanced and comprehensive the discussion that Arvind has on this topic, where you see a lot of shouts going on, and second-rate econometrics being used to make cheap points and so on. So it's really a delight and to be able to have something so solid as this, and he will show it in a moment. Let me just say a few words about Arvind. He's now a professor of economics, as you know. He's a Jagdish Bhagwati professor of Indian political economy. And in the past, he has been chief economist of the Asian Development Bank and worked at the World Bank, IMF, WTO, UNCTAD. So this is one of those rare cases of a professor who is very serious as an academic, and at the same time with a lot of experience in policy circles and debates. And of course, he has many papers in leading journals. I don't need to say that. But let me mention that in terms of books, he has written a book about India, which was is highly regarded. The title is The Emerging Giant in 2008. And for instance, it was picked by the Economist magazine as a definitive book on Indian economy. And his latest book, which in India, I believe, was the title was India's Tryst with Destiny, and it's coming out here. It came out, right?
It just came out.
This week, it must be, or a few days ago, here in the States, under the title of Why Growth Matters. In addition to that, he's an active columnist in the Times of India, the world's highest circulating English language daily, and in many other places. So I don't want to take more time about this. I'm sure that most of you knew that he was a very well-known and highly published economist on this topics in particular. As a discussant, we have the privilege of having Professor Bhagwati, who really doesn't need an introduction, But let me just say that he's presently, for some time already, the university professor at Columbia University and senior fellow in international economics at the Council of Economic Advisors. He has many, many books. He, in addition to his academic work, which is very well known, he has taken many important advisory roles, for example, in GATT as economic policy advisor to Director General Arthur Tunkel, and at the UN to Secretary General Kofi Annan on globalization, and on NEPAD process in Africa. He also works with many NGOs. So this is a real privilege to have these two outstanding economists joining us to have what I'm sure will be a very useful debate about these central issues. Please.
Thank you, Guillermo. It's a great pleasure. I must say I feel very humbled in the company of two potential Nobel laureates. Both of them have been on shortlists of Nobel Prize, and I remain hopeful that when in the future they will be on a shortlist which has only one name on it. Of course, Professor Bhagwati's work is the inspiration for a lot of my work on trade. So his fingerprints, of course, can be seen on a lot of what you will see today. Professor Calvo said, that this is a book I started writing almost actually 5 years ago and had made a lot of progress. So it's about, it's too close. So it was, about 2/3 done when Professor Bhagwati and I ended up getting this big grant on India. And so all my attention got diverted in the last 3 years. Not very much progress has been made. But recently I was at a conference in Manila, and Jeff Williamson from Harvard was there, and he was showing off this book of his whose title was Trade and Poverty. So that immediately gave me an idea that he got the title wrong. It should be Trade and Prosperity. So that's going to be tentatively I thought this is the new title I'm going to use for my book. Now, the talk is based on several of the chapters of the book, and a lot of the material I'm going to try to pull together. But let me start out with a little bit of the background. That I'm going to talk about growth and openness today. You might wonder, why growth, and certainly I'm not thinking of growth for the sake of itself. Incidentally, that is also the title of the latest book that Professor Bhagwati and I have just finished and just came out. So that is the plug for the book. But the objective, why one actually focuses on growth here, is that in the end, growth is central to poverty alleviation, particularly when the countries start out extremely poor, as most developing countries do. No matter how much you say that you want to redistribute, the scope for redistribution is extremely limited. If everybody is nearly poor, those who you can tax to raise revenues that you are going to redistribute are so few, and therefore the revenues that you can raise are also so few, that redistribution is simply not going to go too far. And so growth is really central. So not only, therefore, growth is a sort of double-barrel strategy in the sense that not only growth by itself pulls the poor into gainful employment, thereby helping eradicate poverty, but it also begins to generate larger and progressively increasing revenues, which can then be used for direct expenditure programs on things like education, health, and even direct cash transfers to address poverty more directly. So for both of those reasons, I think growth ultimately is central to the entire process, and this is why we would focus today just on growth. and how openness actually links to it, in what way openness helps. This is a big debate among economists, wide-ranging, very strong positions and views on both sides. But I want to take a cut on this. Very quick kind of bird's eye view on how growth actually does help pull up people, the poor, into gainful employment. I want to use just one South Korean example first very quickly, and then I will launch into the full-scale discussion of the connection between openness and growth. So South Korean example, very instructive one. In early 1960s, it starts opening up and starts growing. But my data I'm going to give you actually start in 1965. So this table gives you the GNP growth. And you can look at the last three, in the last column, just the last three simple averages, aggregate. So Korea grew between 1965 and 73 at 9.2%. So near 10%, double digit. It fell a little bit from 74 to 82 to 7.2, went back between 83 and 90 to about 10%. So this is a period of very rapid growth in Korean history. 25 years altogether is what I have presented to you. What also happened during this period was a very structural transformation of the Korean economy, with the share of agriculture declining, and the share of industry, in particular manufacturing and services, rising. In particular, I want to focus on manufacturing. So look at the column, the fourth column from left, where manufacturing share in 1965 was 17% or 18% or so, and it rises by 1980 within a matter of 15 years to 30%. During this period, share of agriculture drops to 15%. Now, this is a major transformation. And alongside, if employment is also moving, meaning that the workforce is coming out of agriculture into non-agricultural employments, then things are moving, that people are actually being brought into gainful employment. And that is indeed a process that works quite well in Korea. And 1965, you start out with about 9.4% of the workforce in manufacturing. And by 1980, about 21.6%, more than double, it comes in manufacturing. Some of it it expands into services a bit. Because what happens is, if manufacturing is growing, incomes rise, people spend their incomes. So even in terms of the services, the demand for services rises, and that pulls up the services sectors also. So simultaneously, if manufacturing sector is kicking well, it simultaneously also pulls up the services sector. And so there's a double whammy in terms of both output and employment in non-agricultural sectors, which is where the gainful employment opportunities arise. Korean case, actually, now just one last slide here, which gives you the real wages. Now, remember that this is what is happening. So many people are coming out of agriculture into industry, into manufacturing and services. And yet, if you look at what is happening to the wages, it's quite remarkable. Actually, this transformation is accompanied also by rising real wages, which are quite significant increases. Again, you can look at averages if you wish, rather than looking at every one of these entries. Last three entries, on the last two columns. 1965 to 73, real wages rose 9.3%. 74 to 82, 9.6%, and so nearly 10%. Annually, wages have been rising during this period. So you got people moving into manufacturing in massive numbers, as well as real wages rising. That, of course, is a very anti-poverty outcome. It is going to. It is no surprise, actually, that in Korea, within about 2 decades of this rapid growth, abject poverty was pretty much gone, and so the process really was very successful. So this is the what I said earlier, why growth matters, or why we should pay attention to growth. So that's the background or setting up the stage. Now, therefore, the focus on trade openness and growth today, and for that there are three. What is the evidence? Right? This is where the big controversy is, and that's going to be the bulk of the lecture today. Now, so one has to first set the terminology straight. What do we mean by free trade? We use the term free trade, but it is not to be interpreted literally. There are really no examples out in the world actually where countries are complete free trade. Hong Kong is regarded as a classic example, but that is also in goods trade. If you think of the services, even in Hong Kong, you will find some restrictions. And that, of course, is reflected in the services trade negotiations at the WTO, where Hong Kong also does actually make concessions in services trade. So if you really take goods and services all together, there's no country which is complete free trade. So the way I want to interpret this term is either a state of low protection or movement from higher to lower protection. So that's the sense in which, that's a practical way to interpret that, when countries are going towards free trade, or we say that the country is very outward oriented or has an export orientation or what have you. We are basically saying that it has a low level of protection. Or there is also a possibility of interpreting in terms of changes over time. And so any liberalizing movements or country moving to freer trade is another way I'm going to look at this, because for the empirical data that we are going to look at, both interpretations are important. So that's how I'm going to proceed. Now, this is where, as I told you, that the debate is very polarized, and I also want to set. Trade economists have generally not looked at it this way. But it's quite amazingly, I looked at some of the very older literature and found this very insightful description of the way the debate, this is an old debate, as you can see, this is coming from 160 years ago, Frederick Bastiat, who in writing this very short book actually, and if you have not seen it, it really is a remarkable book, very well worth reading, very readable too. Called Economic Sophisms. And he lays this out very nicely, that how the terms of debate between those who argue in favor of free trade and those who oppose it are so very lopsided. And what he said was that, you must, yes, we must admit that our opponents, so our meaning, so Bastiat is speaking for the free trade proponents, and so the opponents are the pro-protection commentators. So he says, yes, we must admit that our opponents in this argument have a marked advantage over us. They need only a few words to set forth a half-truth, whereas in order to show that it is half-truth, we have to resort to long and arid dissertations. That often, and I'll come to it in the second slide, next slide also. He goes on to say that the situation is due to the nature of things. Protection concentrates at a single point the good that it does, while the harm that it inflicts is diffused over a wide area. The good is apparent to the outer eye, the harm reveals itself only to the inner eye of the mind. So, if you're superficial, of course, you go in and actually become an advocate of protection, because he says the good it does, meaning, you impose a tariff, let's say on automobile sector will do better. There's no question, if you try to eliminate protection or at least reduce protection, very likely, it's not inevitable that that protection will actually make automobiles do better, but it's a fair bet that, protection would at least lead to temporarily at least expansion. In the long run, it may still hurt, but temporarily it may show expansion of the automobile sector and say, look, protection has done good. This is his point about, the protection, the good that the protection does is concentrates at a point. But of course, the harm is happening in all the other sectors from which the protected sector is drawing resources. And this is what he's talking about, that this is where the inner eye has to come into play, that this is where more careful analysis, this is where the task of the pro-free trade economist becomes harder, because the harm is spread out into the rest of the economy, and you really have to unearth it, how that has done the harm. So 160 years later, the terms of the debate kind of still remain the same. I'll try to change those as I go. But the proponents must still establish not just preponderance of evidence on their side, but establish also causation. So, today, everything, economists don't accept anything easily. Really established causation that it is indeed being caused by, it's just that it's not a coincidence that both trade and growth might be moving simultaneously. Maybe there's third thing that's moving it, and also there's this causation issue, which, what passes the test of causation, the standards for that are ever rising. So what was acceptable to the econometricians 10 years ago, 20 years ago, is no longer acceptable. Now there is a sizable group of economists who says that, the only way to establish causation properly is to do randomized experiments, which of course on trade you can't tell randomly 20 countries to say that you become free trade and leave the rest of the 10 countries unprotected. Or leave them unliberalized. You just can't do that. That test, the openness or trade can never meet, actually. So, but anyway, the terms remain that way. So the proponents should try to establish causation, and unless this is done, we don't accept it. As far as the opponents are concerned today, basically their task is to poke a few holes in the studies by the proponents. And an excellent example of that is this very famous critique of free trade by Rodriguez and Roderick, Danny Roderick and Rodriguez, who basically, at that time, this was around 1999, they took whatever existing studies of free trade, which supported the case for free trade, econometric studies, they took them and one by one poked a few holes in each of those, and they say, well, therefore the case is not made. Right? So immediately that's out, and then you say, well, you can certainly then go back and also point to the dislocation that, here are these sectors were liberalized, and you can see that, when you liberalize, some reallocation will happen, resources out of those sectors. That is the point of liberalization in the first place. But you'll say, there is this dislocation that happened, injury to these industries as a result of liberalization. And then next step you can do is talk a little bit about infant industry protection, that how, here is Korea, early 70s, some infant industry protection worked or something. And that's basically their basis on which to declare victory. I think, if one is going to do that debate in a balanced way, one should then also ask the opponents or those who think that protection is actually ultimately better for growth. They too should establish causation. They too should be asked, in the way that the proponents of free trade have tried to establish causation. You too show. But that is an exercise which has never been even attempted, actually. So the debate has always been that, well, you claim that there is that free trade or trade liberalization is good, and I show that here are these problems with your studies, and therefore the argument is not accepted. And as a default, then you say, oh, therefore protection is fine. But of course, one could as easily go back and argue the opposite way, that, well, let's say that we evaluate protection itself. And then if you can't show me that protection actually leads to faster growth, then why not free trade be the default option to take? Right? So one has to ask that question in that form, although nobody has actually done. Also, I really think that the baseline to which the trade economists are being held accountable, or that you have to establish such and such, the demands that are required are a little too high. I want to set the bar right. What I'm saying is that the opponents often set the bar too high. In the end, remember that this is a policy question we are asking, that you have to choose between free trade and protection. What is the basis on which I'm going to make that choice, assuming that right now growth is what we are pursuing? So I would argue, and this is where I'm going to reset the bar for this, that there are two propositions that I would argue in favor of, that evidence, pretty persuasively gives me those two propositions. Proposition one, that low or declining barriers to trade, which frequently reflect themselves in a high or rising trade to GDP ratio, are necessary for sustained rapid growth. So, whereas often, the trap into which the trade economist has often fallen is that they want to argue that it's both necessary and sufficient. That's a harder case to argue. I will come to it, why it is much harder to argue. But I don't think to make a choice between protection and freer trade, you need to show that it is both necessary and sufficient. If it is necessary, it's good enough. That's good enough. Okay, the second way I have to look at it is that low or declining barriers to trade are not behind stagnation or declining incomes of the countries. Because the other attack you can sometimes register against free trade is that, look, countries try to open, but this happened particularly in the 1980s when the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund very aggressively forced liberalization onto a lot of the small countries in Africa, particularly, but also Latin America, and growth didn't happen. And some economies didn't do very well, and so they say, well, that somehow trade actually, opening to trade was not only good for growth, but it actually destroyed the economies. So one should be able to systematically show that low or declining barriers to trade are not behind stagnation or declining incomes in the countries. If you make those two propositions, you're home free. I mean, in the end, remember, you're just making a choice between these two options. And the test you have to pass is that, in the end, which one? Is it protection that's necessary for faster growth, or is it freer trade or trade liberalization that is necessary? And conversely, what happens on the other side, that could trade actually lead to, in many cases, what I'd call debacles of the economies later on. Okay, so that's going to be the baseline. I'll reset the bar there. Why the sufficiency condition is not necessary? You shouldn't even expect it, actually. I mean, there are many reasons why your own trade liberalization may not lead to actually any effect at all, right? Because, for example, if the world markets are totally closed, you can open your economy, but if the other economies are closed, you will not get to export anything, so nothing will change. Okay, so that's one very dramatic one. I mean, it's not reality. I mean, the world markets are not closed, but it's a way to see that, look, sufficiency condition is need not meet. Also, if you haven't got your internal transportation infrastructure worked out, so that there are not enough roads that connect the production hubs to the ports, or if there are no ports, if you've thrown rocks into your ports so that no ships can come in nor go out, then obviously goods cannot move out either. So that also you can liberalize trade, but nothing will happen. So it should be no surprise. And I also talked a bit about domestic distortions. Sometimes you may straitjacket your factor markets in such a way that basically it just doesn't allow you much supply response. You may just have such laws, such inflexibilities in the factor markets that the resources may fail to move even if you change the price incentives. So things like licensing policies, they may simply not allow resources to move in and out, in which case you can free up trade, but you'll get no action. So again, that gets you to the complementary policies that may be essential and all. So no claim here that trade by itself will be sufficient, okay? But I will argue empirically, at least, that it's going to be necessary. To choose between low and declining protection and high or rising protection, we only need to know which of them promises the superior outcome, which of them is generally a part of the policy package, followed by countries experiencing sustained rapid growth. So I also don't want to make the case here that countries that have experienced sustained rapid growth have done so only with free trade. There are complementary policies that you can identify in most, South Korea we talked about, Taiwan we could talk about, China you can talk about. So the complementary policies as well. Question is that, the point, however, is that in each of these cases, liberal trade policies were an integral part of the policy packages. The evidence. So now we turn to the evidence. This is the core of the lecture. We are going to look at the evidence at 3 different levels. Okay, so at the aggregate level, over time, how the developing, now remember this is all about developing countries, so I'm not even going to mention any of the developed countries, at least not their growth. If I mention, that will be only in the context of, if they are relevant to the growth in the developing countries. So aggregate evidence over time, overall growth experience of the developing countries during various phases over 45 years spanning 1961 to 2005. I mentioned to you, I started, I've not made progress for the last 3 years, so So this is for about 45-year period up to 2005 from 1961, my data. And it nicely kind of breaks into 3 equal periods of 15 years. And it also actually turns out to be a very sensible division of the 45-year period, although I will look at alternative ways of slicing the periods as well. Because sometimes you can, by choosing the dates, cutoff points in a certain way, you can make the results look a little slanted. So I just want to make sure that I don't do that slanting. So I'll look at alternative divisions also, but largely I will look at 15, 15, and 15-year periods. So that's the first. Then I look at cross-country evidence, where I would I'll define this miracles and debacles. This is an old paper I had done almost 10 years ago, but I'll update a lot of what I did there. And then within cross-country, we'll also look at some of the evidence that comes from the regression analysis. That too, I think the critics of free trade have downplayed a little too much. I think there is reasonably compelling evidence from the cross-country regressions actually that shows rising per capita incomes with trade with faster trade. And then the third approach is the country case studies. I'll mention these. I'm not sure how, depending, we don't have the time to do all the country case studies, but I will mention a few, and that will be the roadmap for much of the remaining lecture. I would then, so country case studies I'll kind of gloss over. We'll take up maybe in question answer session. Then I want to finally go to some of the arguments against free trade that the critics of free trade have made, and I want to dissect some of those arguments. Okay, so that's the remaining lecture. All right, evidence at the aggregate level. Now, 1960 to 1980, that often by the free trade critics is characterized as the golden period of growth for the developing countries. You can read Danny Roderick, you can read Chang, more recently from 2007. This is a view to which they have held on, the critics. That 1960 to 75 represents the golden age of development, with the developing countries growing faster than in any other period. And remember here that Danny Roderick is writing in 1999, so perhaps a little forgivable. Chang is writing in 2007, and therefore has all the data available to him up to the point 2005 that I am working with. I mean, in 2007, those data were actually available. Most of the work I did for this was in 2007 or 2008, so these data have been around. They also then say that, well, this is a golden period of growth, and it also happens to be the period of import substitution, industrialization, and therefore it is import substitution which does a lot better as far as growth in the poor countries is concerned, not outward-oriented trade policies. So that's one way that the free trade critics have argued. I want to ask 2 questions here. That is the claim on growth factually true? I mean, it was either 1960 to 80 or 1960 to 75 really a period of golden growth, or data tell you otherwise? So that's the first question I'm going to ask, and answer that in the negative, that no, in fact, it is the later period that turns out to show unambiguously faster growth. So that's going to be my one point. The other question I want to ask is that, were the fast-growing countries indeed pursuing import substitution policies during the period 1960 to 75 or 1960 to 80? I mean, you got to ask both questions. That even if actually, factually is the growth faster in that first period, and then ask, well, even if that were true, did that faster growth happen because of import substitution or outward orientation? I mean, that both questions have to be asked. You can't assume that 1960 to 75 was a period of import substitution. You got to test it. You got to look at the evidence. So here's the growth rates, and I tried to, as I said, cut it in many different ways. 61 to 75, you get 2.7% growth at the aggregate level. 1976 this per capita. 1976 to 90, you take 1.7. 91 to 2005, unambiguous is 3.5%. It is significantly higher rate of growth in the third period. So certainly, this claim of 61 to 75 being the golden age of growth is false. I mean, that's factually false. You can cut it differently, as I show here, 61 to 73. You might say that, oil price crisis happened after 73, 74. So we shouldn't really include those years post oil price crisis. So cut it at 61 to 73. Rearrange it. You change the picture even more favorably towards 91 to 2007 is 3.9% actually. So I just go up to another 2 years. Note another fact here in this table, that the OECD countries' growth is also shown in the last column. And what you will find is that actually OECD countries in the first period are growing much faster. Whereas in the third period, the OECD countries are growing very slowly. So in effect, really, at least prima facie, what that tells you is that much of the momentum of growth is coming from the policy changes within developing countries in the third period, whereas some of the momentum, at least in the first period, was coming from very rapid growth in the OECD countries themselves. So even in spite of much slower growth in the third period in the OECD countries, developing countries end up doing a hell of a lot better. So that evidence also indicates, at least certainly points to the something different going on in the developing countries themselves. Alternative cutoff dates, so you can do, so I do it by decades. You again find in the end the 2000s decade turns out to be the fastest, but even 1990s is faster. So 2000s is the fastest, but even 1990s is faster than your 61 to 70 or 70s decade. Whichever way you want to cut it, you'll find ultimately it's the latter part, post-1990 period, which is characterized by the highest rate of growth. This is clearly a period of increased openness in the developing countries. To that, there is no question. The whole lot of globalization that was done during the 1980s under the basic conditionalities of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, but also simultaneously a lot of the countries taking the lesson, looking at what Korea did, what happened to Taiwan, what happened to Singapore, etc. A lot of the work that got done in the 70s, actually, big project, Professor Bhagwati and Kruger project on behalf of NBER that was done, which intellectually it changed the landscape as well. Preceding that, there was the Little Skotowski and Scott OECD project, of which again Bhagwati and Desai book on India was a part. All that really helped change the intellectual, certainly tilt the thinking back towards freer trade. If you look at the intellectual history, 1950s, everybody agreed actually that import substitution was the way to go. Even those who eventually became proponents of free trade actually were pretty soft on that in the 1950s. I mean, Ian Little, for example, who was one of the three, Little, Skotowski, and Scott project, the OECD project, which was the first one on this, Ian Little actually initially was very, he wrote in very approving terms of India's import substitution policies. But in the end, having seen what had happened in these four Far Eastern economies, he changed his mind. And subsequently, of course, a lot of the other work as well. So, two factors stand out, I've already pointed out. So let me go to the next. We should also ask, as I said, whether the first period was characterized by import substitution. Well, it turns out actually the aggregate growth, after all, is being driven by growth in the individual countries. So you have to look at which individual countries really were growing so rapidly during this period. Well, we all know actually South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, those are the four tigers that were growing very rapidly. These countries were not import substitution countries, these were outward-oriented countries. Even Brazil, actually, it turns out, if you look at it carefully, there's a period 69 to 75, during which Brazil has a very rapid growth, 8.3% annually on a per capita basis. Phenomenal, I mean, this is, for Brazil, has never repeated that kind of performance, actually, even for that short period of about 6 or 7 years. But during this period, actually, Brazil also turns out trade was growing very rapidly. And moreover, Brazil actually did knock down trade barriers during this period, and it depreciated the domestic currency. So all liberalizing measures. Okay, so that's the aggregate. Now to come to cross-country very quickly. What does cross-country evidence show me? Well, here then one goes back and looks more comprehensively at individual countries. Basic idea is to look at what happened to growth, what was happening to the trade openness as measured by export to GDP ratio or import to GDP ratio or trade to GDP ratio. Okay, and what I do is I classify these countries into three groups. One group is called miracle countries, where annual per capita incomes grew at 3% or more over the 15-year period. So those I said miracles. I mean, it's an arbitrary definition. You can change that to 4% if you want, or you can change it to 2.5%. That doesn't really change the picture. I try to do different cutoffs, and nothing very much changes in the story that emerges. Then second group is called the debacle countries. These are countries where negative growth in per capita income was either zero, so it's stagnant in per capita terms, or negative, therefore declining. So I call these debacles. And there is a third group at which I'm not going to look at, because that's the two extremes is where the interesting insights might come through. And the question I ask is whether the miracles are associated with trade expansion, defined in a certain way, and whether debacles are associated with import surges, right? I mean, so this is the idea whether fast growth in trade helps GDP growth, and whether or it might actually do exactly the opposite, that import surges happen and that destroys the domestic industry and that causes stagnation. Okay, so again, for the three periods, here is the miracle, my summary. There's a very detailed data which I don't present here. I just give you the summary here of the countries where I can find all the necessary information. So first period, 61 to 75, you get 21 countries that grow at 3% or more in per capita terms. 19 of those experience rising exports to GDP ratio. The second period, 76 to 90, you get 22 countries with similar growth, 15 of which experience rising exports to GDP ratio. And the last period, you get 34 of those countries, with 27 of them experiencing rising exports to GDP ratio. Now remember that here I am imposing a very demanding requirement, because this is the ratio. GDP has been growing at the miracle rates. Exports have to grow much faster than the GDP to actually get the exports to GDP ratio to rise. So the bar is high here, if one is looking at what is happening to trade. Also notice once again that in terms of thinking about the golden age, how much population is impacted. And really in the first period, it's only 15% of the population that is actually living in these miracle countries. In the second period, almost 45%, and it's really the third period when 65%. This is where the big impact in poverty is happening. Of course, we know where is that 65% coming from. Both India and China are part of the miracle story in the third period. So you get these two massive countries getting impacted by high growth. On the debacle side, you really again don't get that kind of story. In the first periods, you get 6 countries which are stagnant or declining in per capita terms, of which only one experiences import growth at 5% or more. And even that is really not compelling, because often when countries are doing poorly, aid comes in, and so imports still can be sustained at high level. But I'll not make that argument here. Just look at even the numbers in the second period. This is where I think a lot of the critics got a lot of mileage from this particular period, 76 to 90. This is also the period of liberalization of the Soviet Union. You got the Eastern and Central European countries, which all actually initially suffered. And that is precisely what you see here, that 38 of the countries during this period were experiencing either zero growth in per capita income or even negative growth. But even there, when you look at how many countries in how many countries this is being pushed by the import surges, you don't see very many. You got only 4 there. And in the third period, you got 23 countries which have less than 3% growth. Many of these countries, if I update the data to about 2010 now, will probably shift out, because a lot of the countries now which were not doing so well until 2005 have picked up actually, both in Latin America and Africa. So when I update the data, picture will only look better, not worse. Okay, so that's the story on the debacle and miracles, and clearly, at least the prima facie evidence, if you will, is that growth is accompanied by free trade, or certainly accompanied by rising trade in the countries. Now comes the causation. Again, critics will come in and say that, well, all you have seen is that both are moving together, but how do you know what is causing what? Right? And maybe it's something else. The economy is growing rapidly. Danny Roderick tells this story that, like, in the context of Korea and Taiwan, that, basically what happened was that internally Korea did something, solving some sort of coordination failure problem, which gave rise to increased demand for investment. And increased demand for investment meant that you needed foreign machinery, so you needed to import. And then, of course, through the trade balance condition, if you're going to import more, you've got to export more. So his story is that actually this is all internal momentum which caused this. That story, of course, it's very easy to dispute. I'll come to it later on, actually, in responding to the critics. But that's a kind of story that the free trade critics or proponents of protection like to make, that, well, causation, whatever you have shown here is anyway doesn't establish causation. So what does it mean? Of course, it also doesn't establish causation that protection is doing it, and so in the end you've got to make a choice. But nevertheless, let's pursue the causation issue a little bit in greater detail. So there are four responses to those that I want to make. First of all, critics have provided no evidence in favor of their hypothesis. That okay, so suppose I say, well, free trade didn't do it. Well, show me that the protection did it, right? So in the end, you've got to make a choice between the policies, and you have to have some basis also if you're going to. It can't be done by default. That's my first response. Second is that the low or declining barriers to trade are part of almost all rapid growth stories. I mean, that's hell of a coincidence, right? I mean, we are not talking here only of the rising trade, but actually trade barriers you can look at, and every single country that grows rapidly, either protection level is low, I mean, that's Singapore and Hong Kong would be the clear examples, or protection is declining. If protection is high, then protection is declining during this rapid acceleration of growth. And there you will put in countries like South Korea and Taiwan, 60s and 70s, you'll put China there, you'll put India there, a lot of the other countries, Chile, maybe Colombia, you've got Peru, countries in Africa as well. So, I mean, that's a hell of a coincidence is the way I would kind of react. Then, if trade expansion is really the objective, so let's say that, we don't know which way the causation is going, but we know that, boy, if I can get trade growing, rapid growth will be supported, right? So even if the momentum is internal, to maintain the momentum in the growth, I need to expand trade, right? Well, what is my policy prescription there? If that is the case, clearly the policy prescription is that I should be liberalizing trade, allow trade to happen. I mean, in Roderick's story, right, for example, if there is pressure to import more, import restrictions are not going to help. You've got to let the imports come in. And likewise, you've got to let the exports to go out, which means liberal trade policies. You can't say that, because my causation is flowing this way, I can do anything I want to trade policy. In fact, this is exactly what India did. So there's a clear contrast I've drawn often between Korea and India, that Korea let trade happen. So even if you believe that momentum for growth was initially coming from growth and then leading to faster trade, you can't scuttle trade. I mean, India effectively exactly that way, believed in this story of coordination failure or coordination markets leading to coordination failure, and so it tried to solve that failure all sorts of ways, with this public sector undertaking manufacturing activity, with the public sector giving licenses that, so if I'm going to need inputs, I'm going to give a license for the inputs. If I need final output, I'll final out. I mean, all sorts of ways tries to, right? But simultaneously, it also scuttled trade, right? So even with that kind of licensing policy, with that kind of intervention in the domestic economy, if the economy had been left a bit more open, perhaps the kind of debacle that happened in India for about 30 to 35 years, from 1950 to mid-1980s, would not have happened. Certainly, maybe much more rapid growth would not have happened, but certainly it would have been a lot better. So, it is an issue as to what you do to trade policy, even if you don't know which way the causation is flowing. I mean, if you know just the association that fast trade has to accompany the fast growth, the prescription has to be. I mean, I draw this analogy with the tap, that even if the pressure of water is extremely high, if the tap is closed, no water can flow. And that's the trade policy analogy that, if you're closing the tap, it's like autarkic trade policies. But if you if the tap is open, when pressure rises, meaning pressure for growth comes in, water will flow through, growth will materialize. So it's still in terms of policy, that's where you want to go. And finally, I want to also quickly point out some actual compelling evidence that from the regression studies that does exist. So here it is. Critics argue that GDP growth increases the demand for imports. Okay, so this I've mentioned to you. Let me, this we have discussed. So come to the econometrics, right? So there are two broad approaches to econometric studies. Both pose a problem. Either you take trade barriers as the independent variable and then growth on the left-hand side and try to see that relationship, or you put trade on the right-hand side as the variable, exogenous variable, and look at growth, what it is doing. Both has problems of endogeneity. I mean, simultaneity is that, I mean, even trade barriers may be influenced by what is happening to growth through political economy pressures, etc., etc. So both of them have these problems, this identification, the famous identification problem. Okay, apparently there is a very nice studies by Frankel and Romer initially, which was then done further by Frankel and Rose. I mean, that is the paper I peg a lot of the causation establishment on. And this is the study. What these people do is say, look, okay, so we know that there is this two-way causation possibility. So let's identify a part of trade where two-way causation is not running. And this is the trade that we can explain based purely on distance. Now, those of you who know about the gravity equation, apparently some part of the trade is driven just by distance. That countries that are close to each other in terms of distance trade a lot more, and countries that are far apart trade a lot less. So distance by itself is a measure. So that's the instrument actually that Frankel and Rose use, and say that let's separate out this part of the trade which is caused by the distance, and then we are going to use that part of the trade to see whether it impacts per capita income or not. So that is a clean kind of way to identify the effect. And it turns out that that effect, it does show a very, very strong effect. So Rodriguez and Roderick have raised several objections to, so the first paper was Frankel and Romer, along using this technique. And Rodriguez and Roderick eventually raised a lot of objections to it. Roderick raised a lot of objections to it. Finally, when Frankel and Rose did the second paper, they took care of every one of those objections. So in the published version of the Frankel and Rose paper, this is how they put it. Still the key question concerns the implications of these perturbations pointed out by Rodriguez and Roderick and Roderick 2000 for the openness variable. In every case, and this is the italics are in original, I did not change it. In every case, regardless of whether the other controls are included or not, the openness variable retains most of its magnitude and all of its statistical significance in the presence of each of the three Rodriguez-Roderick modifications. The t statistics are 3 to 4. So at least this one even nails down the econometric causation. It's still not randomized experiment, but that is how that is how far you can go with econometric evidence. Well, I come back finally and ask, well, what have the critics of free trade shown? Have they themselves presented any evidence that would be in any way persuasive to showing that protection actually leads to faster growth, right? So the most you can find is this regression by Danny Roderick, where he just has these aggregate tariff rates and growth rates in 1990s plotted, and the plot shows it upwards. So he says, oh, wow, look, I found this rising tariff associated with rising growth. But he doesn't report the t statistics that he is getting, which means that obviously it's not a statistically significant result in the first place. But he has all these two-way causations happening. All the two-way causations that he complains about are in here also. And of course, the protection itself is very poorly measured because 1990s, a lot of quantitative restrictions existed. You can't go with just average tariffs during the period to show that. So, but this is the most you see from the other side, right? So what have they shown? Nothing. Okay, country case studies I'm going to skip, but just maybe I'll show you one picture of India. Look, how India looks. Look at this. This is the trade imports to GDP ratio. 1969-70, you go to 4%. That's about autarky, as close to autarky as you can, pretty much. At 0%, you get to autarky. This is the period during which, India really grows in per capita terms about less than 1.5%. And in fact, 69-70 is part of the period, 10-year period during which growth was not even that, actually it was less than 0.5%. So it is really, but you can look at the good, interesting picture of Chinese. Look, the red line is Chinese and the blue one is American. And these are the shares in world trade. And look what has happened to China. I mean, it starts at 1980 and bang, see how it is going so rapidly. So you see the countries that have grown rapidly at these 8, 9, 10%, there's no way they can grow without trade allowed to grow. I mean, in the end, that's where the action shows up. Okay. Lastly, I'll take 5 to 7 more minutes and want to very quickly knock down some of what I call the specious arguments by the critics. That will be my last part of the talk, and I'll conclude. So trade liberalization. So these are the various arguments they make. Let's take each of these. So trade liberalization has failed to catalyze and sustain growth in many instances. Right? This is the argument about necessity versus sufficiency that I addressed before. Right? So you can, you can come up with a lot of cases where trade liberalization happened and growth didn't catalyze. I mean, 1980s particularly is full of that, full of examples from that. Eventually, the response did happen. Actually, it turns out, and a lot of the countries today are growing very rapidly. So that liberalization paid off perhaps much later, but it certainly did. No serious trade economies offers free trade as the cure-all formula to overcome stagnation, external or internal conflict, lack of policy credibility, macroeconomic instability, overvalued exchange rate, product and factor market rigidities, and poor infrastructure may conspire to block the benefits of an open trade regime from being realized. So that's neither here nor there. Second, they say, well, trade did not catalyze many of the growth miracles. So here, the opposite, that, well, let's take the growth miracles that did happen, and I'm going to show you that trade was not what catalyzed it, something else did. So in the case of China, they would say that, it was in agricultural liberalization that led to the growth catalyzation, right? Which is land reform and all. In South Korea, Danny Roderick says that, it was investment coordination failure problem that the government solved, which led to this kind of growth. So it was not trade that catalyzed the rapid growth. In the Indian case, you have Roderick and Subramaniam saying, there was some kind of change of attitude. I'm not sure what that means really, but the attitudes of the officials changed, and that certainly had India growing at a faster rate. But, problems with the argument are that trade liberalization was at least a partial catalyst in all these 3 cases. I do document. And even if we reject that claim, rapid growth has been sustained over a long period by knocking down trade barriers in all of the cases. So even if you say that, well, initial catalyst was not trade, policy question still remains that when growth has been catalyzed, do you want to remain protected or do you want to actually open up to trade? And in every one of these cases, actually, whether you take Korea, you take China, you take India, in every one of these cases, growth was sustained by liberalizing trade as the process moved forward. There is a high protection does not preclude rapid growth. So look, China with high protection, it was growing rapidly. At 1980s, China was still very highly protected. India, you can argue India is even today highly protected. I mean, some would argue, I don't quite agree with that, but in principle, you can make that sort of argument. And say, look, high protection really doesn't preclude high growth. It says, well, true, high initial trade barriers don't preclude onset of rapid growth. You can start. I mean, Korea, even in the early 60s, you could argue that when Korean growth took off, it was still pretty protected regime. And certainly China was in the 1980s, and India, you can certainly, in the 1990s, you can say, a lot of the liberalization happened afterwards. But the point simply is that in the end, yes, growth can be catalyzed at high degree of protection, but unless you are going to liberalize, you're not going to sustain it. In every one of these cases, countries continuously liberalized and became more and more open. So sustaining as well as accelerating of growth actually goes hand in hand with countries liberalizing. Finally, import substitution has preceded outward orientation. There is an argument made, oh, look, in the Taiwanese case, there was some import substitution done, or Korean case, import substitution done in the initial early stages. So you need import substitution. Again, that's questionable, because I can give you the example of Hong Kong, where there was no import substitution and it grew purely under outward-oriented open trade regime. So it's certainly not the case that you necessarily need import substitution in some early years. And even in these cases, it's not compelling. Just because import substitution preceded doesn't mean that it was required for the faster growth. So, and anyway, today, in today's world, it's 65 years later, most countries, certainly 40 to 60 years later, after independence, certainly that initial period of import substitution is now over. So it really doesn't have a whole lot of relevance. They say most successful countries have deployed industrial policy. There's another argument made, that Korea did industrial policy, Taiwan did industrial policy, etc., etc. Again, that's neither here nor there, because, that's a separate debate. I mean, first we can argue about whether industrial policy was the major factor in the growth process in Korea and Taiwan or not. We can argue about that, but forget that, one or the other way. The point is that with or without industrial policy, was the trade policy outward oriented or not? And answer there, of course, is yes. So you can't ignore trade just by telling me that, there was industrial policy. Well, industrial policy in an open trade regime or a closed trade regime? You've got to answer that question. And, depending on one's stance on industrial policy, one can plausibly argue that the lower declining trade barriers either minimize the damage that industrial policy did, or it may have maximized the benefits from them if you believe that industrial policy was a good thing. So, final argument about this infinite industry argument, I will not go into this, but logically speaking, actually, to date, nobody has given a properly well-argued infant industry protection case for protection, right? Not for intervention. Different interventions, you can make a theoretical case, but it is damn hard, actually, to make a case for protection, using protection to promote infant industry protection. And in fact, the last word on it, really analytically speaking, comes from Robert Baldwin, who is no more. But he wrote this wonderful article in the Journal of Political Economy in 1969, and nobody, to my knowledge, has satisfactorily overcome the objections that Baldwin raised there. And his point was this, summarized beautifully: if the infant industry argument for tariff protection is worthy of its reputation as the major exception to free trade case, it should be possible to present a clear analytical case based upon well-known and generally accepted empirical relationships unique to infant industries for the general desirability and effectiveness of protective duties in these industries. The contention of this paper is that such a case cannot be made. That really is the last word. And truly, that's you have to go back and read Baldwin's paper to see exactly how he reaches that conclusion. But I have read it very carefully, and I think he's got it exactly right, that a logical case for intervention can be made, but not for protection based on infant industries. So I think, the case for free trade, all in all, is pretty impeccable. Debate goes on, but I think it does seem to go on in a bit of an intellectual vacuum. And it's simply, I think, it goes back to Bastiat, why it looks so attractive. It's very easy to a lazy person. It's much easier to argue for protection, that, look, you protect the industry and this industry will kind of prosper, might prosper. And certainly immediately it will probably prosper because, basically stemmed out competition from abroad. So temporarily at least it might prosper, and chances are it will. It also sounds very plausible. So, but that's a lazy man's way of looking at it. That's where you can't rely on the outer eye, as Bastiat argued. You got to go back, do the hard work, use your inner eye, and see what else is going on. So I'll conclude with that. Thank you very much.
Jagdish, would you like to stand up?
That was a very impressive review of all the arguments, and you set up all the criticisms and took them on one by one. Obviously, I have to study this in some depth, but I think everything that you seemed to do was certainly very persuasive. But let me shift the way one looks at the problem a little bit in a different direction. It can be reconciled with this. First, let me add that when you say that there are debacles and miracles, and there are associations between high growth and high growth of trade, all right? That's really an association. So he correctly points out that people like Roderick would say, we don't know what causes what. And, there's a funny story. This is an identification problem. When you have quantity and price data, are you plotting a supply curve or a demand curve? But the way to explain it, I think, which I think comes across well, is that there's a story, there's a country which you will be able to infer. It's certainly not in Latin America when I point out what the story is, which is that the women are very bad cooks and the husbands are very bad lovers. And the question is, what causes what, right? Are the women being punished for cooking bad food, or are the men being punished for being bad lovers? So that's an identification problem. And so he's dealing with, so when Roderick says it's really trade that is affecting growth, or it's not trade that's affecting growth, but it's growth that's affecting trade, clearly, there is a relevant problem there, okay? And I think he's dealing with it. So I think you should pay attention to that particular problem, because associations multiply like hell. And I think our colleague, Xavier, Sarai Martin has an article, I think in the American Economic Review, saying, last night or last week I ran 2 million regressions. Now, of course, I'm going to make a Marxist point, which is that technology affects the way you do things. In India, we didn't have any money in my time to run any regression practically. So we had to sit down and think, is this worth running? Is there likely to be a link here, right? So we had to think through. But now you have 2 million regressions, and you can even write an article in American Economic Review saying, I ran 2 million regressions. So instead of being drummed out with the profession, you celebrate such things, right? So things have changed. But I think we need to remember that, we have to ask the questions, which I think, with Professor Panagariya was dealing with. Going back to the linkage, you see, which is really another. So first we have these data sets and so on, and he's telling you what relationships he's worked out and what the objections are. And I think he responded to the criticism very well. But then you see, you go back again to the linkage, you see. So like you don't have money for regressions, and you really want to know why it is that trade is related to growth. All right. So you have the head and you have the tail, but you've got to have the body in between to connect the two, right? And so that's really the way that's exactly what he's doing. And there I think the problem is that with all economics actually, establishing that linkage theoretically, almost anything is possible in the following sense, which is that you could say, just take trade and GNP, right? Forget about growth, only temporarily. I'll come back to it. But GNP, which is what we teach, the gains from trade theorem, right? That when you open up, when a country which has an open economy is going to have greater GNP, or better welfare, higher welfare is the way, so you have a PPC and you move along it. And then you are on a higher indifference curve, which is the way we describe it in 101 classes. Right? So that is the theory about the gains from trade, right? And there's a lot written on making it the case tighter and tighter and tighter, so that we know exactly the conditions under which it could be undermined. Okay, But we leave that to mathematical economists. We really go by Adam Smith's common sense. So, the very fierce gains from trade theorems like McFadden's article in the Journal of International Economics, and, you've got to put a towel on your head if you're not a mathematical economist to see. And in the end, he says, yeah, there is gains from trade. So we say, okay, fine, we just go to the conclusion, and we're happy with this has come out. And this is actually why when I was young, I went to both MIT and Chicago. Fortunately, longer at MIT and shorter at Chicago. And it turned out that people were doing mathematical economics and econometrics, both at MIT, because normally, once you do mathematics, you do mathematical statistics, and econometrics and mathematical economics are pursued at the same time, and virtually like it is now. But at Chicago, there was hardly any mathematical economics, and there was, a great deal of econometrics, except for Zava, which was a temporary aberration. And there, my view of it was exactly the following, that to the naked eye, everything seemed highly imperfect, right? We had Chamberlain and Joan Robinson and so on. So if you lost faith in the marketplace, because to the naked eye, everything does look imperfect, right? So at Chicago, they were working with econometrics to say that the world is as if perfect. So if you were a PhD student, you had to hypothesize that there was, in fact, like soap wasn't priced by Procter & Gamble. They just thought that they were doing it, but in point of fact, it's the as-if competition was actually making it an as-if competitive model. So you're back to the welfare theorems and to the efficacy in the marketplace. All that faith, lack of faith, then disappears. So everybody, all the students were working away, putting up competitive, as-if competitive hypothesis. And then when you had a good regression, on that hypothesis, then you got your PhD. So everybody was doing econometrics. So nobody was doing mathematical economics, but they were doing econometrics, because econometrics was a handmaiden for saying that you were actually, markets worked. And so that is where I think I just bring this out because essentially econometrics has to be used the way he is talking about it. But at the same time, you also have the basic models of, which you want to work with and the connections. So econometrics may be used in that way. It can be used in any way you like, but today we do use econometrics to see whether the hypothesis you have really work. So going back to the gains from trade, we know that, we can actually invoke McFadden, etc., to say that there are gains from trade. We don't have to worry about that, and that is good for us who do this. But on the other hand, if you say the world is full of imperfections, so if you turn into an MIT economist from Chicago economist, and you say, look, everything is imperfect, and that's some of the things which Danny is probably saying, then we don't have a neat theorem at all. So we then have to go around identifying all these imperfect, which is, we can, I wouldn't do that. But that is really the problem, I think, with even gains from trade, which is generally considered as being reasonable. So like your real wage rigidity. You can have unemployment by opening your market, right? If you're simply, people don't insist on the same real wage, but they just want to work in a particular region. Like Lancashire, UK opens up trade. Lancashire is producing textiles, and people in textiles industry will not, first will not accept decline in real wage, in which case the industry is to contract. So you get unemployment. But if you have factor immobility, they just don't want to move from Lancashire. They're happy with the Lancashire accents and going to the pubs there and so on and so forth. So that's part of their culture. If they don't move, the wages will fall, but they're happy. They don't care. So there is a distinction between factor price rigidity and factor price inflexibility. So we know that. But if we have factor price rigidity, then gains from trade, you get screwed a little bit, right? And so you have to, I'm just giving one example. So even with what we think is, fine in terms of gains from trade, because most people accept that, you have to still worry about people who might be cussed and don't give you all kinds of imperfections. I would generally dismiss it because I think Arvind's approach is quite correct, which is that do these kinds of arguments or complexities matter or not? But when it comes to growth, there people don't have the same conviction, as it were, from a number of models that really that is something where a link can be properly established. So on gains from trade, which is a static thing, and on growth, I think you will concede that among the opponents, you have actually many people do argue that the trade theories are fine as far as gains from trade are concerned, but they're not. We don't really have strong theorems on growth and being connected to trade. So I just would, I think you may want to address that. And it's very easy to see. Take Harrod-Doma model, for example, which is the growth rate is the savings rate divided by the marginal capital output ratio. And you can then say that the marginal capital output ratio is, of course, the productivity of investment. Marginal capital means investment. So that is the productivity. So if the productivity is fine or given to you, then if you want to increase the growth rate, you want to increase the savings, right? And if you have a second best problem where the savings rate is not something which you can manipulate through fiscal policy or otherwise, so you don't have control over that, then the market determined distribution of income will affect the little s, the average savings ratio. So growth may be compromised by current efficiency or through opening up trade, because while your capital output ratio is going to be doing well because gains from trade are maximized, therefore from any given investment, so you're actually minimizing the little v in the S over V equation. You get an offsetting argument on the numerator. So there are models on that as well, right? Now, whether this matters or not, of course, is an empirical question, right? In some countries, you may have control over the savings rate and so on. But all I'm saying is that the kinds of linkages we establish on the growth side, I think, tend to be a little more challengeable. Not that Danny makes those arguments, but I'm simply saying from a theoretical point of view, the linkage which we would like to believe between open markets and growth rates is a little more challengeable in my view. And this is why your work is harder. And this is, I'm not saying it's harder than what you did, but it's harder than what you might think. And this is why it's a real challenge to work this out. And I think we do know that because of this association, there might be some presumption that all these qualifying arguments like second best and so on are not probably particularly important in the end. And then I think in the end, given all the arguments he has, to me, since there are Korean students present and so on, there is whether in fact you can have sustainable growth without open markets is an important question, and open markets and more efficient systems and so on. So there's a funny story, which is true actually, about my radical teacher, Joan Robinson, and Gus Rainis, who was a mainstream economist he's still alive, I should say was, but is, at Yale. They were both, somebody overheard them agreeing that Korea was a remarkable success story. They couldn't believe it until they realized that she had in mind North Korea and he had in mind South Korea. Now, but we look at the growth story of the two countries, right? And this is what Danny needs to remember, in my view. North Korea was not a sustainable, right? I mean, it can do things like what is now threatening the world with, just like the Soviet Union, low productivity, inefficient system. But they could send, this Gagarin or whatever, or Valentina up into the space. So, the thing about non-market systems is that they can concentrate resources on one objective, but you have a desert across the system, right? So given enough time, we know now who was right, Joan or Gus. Obviously, Joan was wrong, right? Because there's no way, you would not want to. This was not a sustainable outcome. So when Danny again says, oh, but you can have growth, despite all kinds of things which we on this side of the table consider to be crazy interventions and so on, he may be right even for 20 years, like in like in the Soviet Union, right? Which was a horrible story. But with high rates of investment, it managed to put along. In the end, it has to come crashing down. It just cannot be sustained. So I think, in my judgment, qualitatively, I would simply say that, when Professor Panagariya produces all these arguments, I think he's basically on the right track, because openness and giving more freedom to invest and so on, to respond to market incentives as determined by openness as well, all of that is very important in shaping up the system. And you see that, and that's what his data show, basically. And despite all the objections which Danny Roderick might raise, in the end it's not compelling, because you really can't quarrel with these very powerful associations. It's very difficult to, we are from India, appearances are not deceptive sometimes. We are from India, and we look Indian. So over there, we could say, right, that opening up the system did in fact make a dramatic change, a difference to the growth rate. And it wasn't just the openness, but also, a lot of bad things go together, and a lot of good things go together. So how to, say, this is due to that particular element in the program is very hard, okay? You might as well admit. So I would say a package of reforms really affects the outcome. And then you rely on econometricians. They can have a good time trying to sort out the partial derivatives as to what caused what. If you want to believe that sort of stuff, you're free to do so. Producer sovereignty. But, I just say, look, here is this package. All the reforms really pushed in the direction. And we saw a massive acceleration in the growth rate, right? Which in turn also affected poverty, as he was saying. So prosperity and poverty usually go together. And this is the last point I would simply make. We were in Washington yesterday selling our book, because nowadays you don't write a book. You also have to sell it by giving lectures and so on. So maybe if some of you want to come and beat the drum and say, Professor Bhagwati and Panagariya are coming, please, we'll pay you a little sum of money. Because otherwise, books are not allowed to be sold on their own, right? You have the same experience. So we were there, and then Dr. Kim, the World Bank president, had suddenly announced, that he was going to look at the bottom 40%. And this is an Indian objective function, because we don't worry about the 1%. For all I care, the 1% could be sent to Florida, and then hopefully they sink down the sinkhole and disappear from view. If you want more kicks, you could line them up and shoot them over here, but there are consequences to that. You could get locked up or something. So in India, we've always said people below the poverty line should be our ethical objective. And growth, particularly which was produced by growing openness along with other reforms, right? Dismantling senseless interventions and so on. So all of that produced a growth which then pulled up people into gainful employment. And so that was our objective. If a few people made some money, well, so be it. I mean, when they get born again, we believe in being born again. Then maybe, somebody will take care of them. They'll probably be born in the bottom 30%, hopefully. But anyway, that is something we were not worried about that, and I think Pope Francis is also a Jesuit. I went to a Jesuit school, and this is where he's talking about the poor. He's not talking about the rich. Exactly the right thing. So, Occupy movement and the 1% wallahs, like Piketty and so on. Who cares? I mean, if they want to worry about the 1%, let them do it. But don't distort our objectives. So once we have that, and so again, 40% is what Dr. Kim is supposed to have said, but it's not. The 40% is not a very sensible way to think about it. You have to have a poverty line and then define whether the 20% or 30% who are below that line. So it won't be the same thing forever. But he's sort of jumping onto the bandwagon and now saying, 40%. So we were passing the World Bank and there were 2 or 3 ambulances and so on. So I remarked to Professor Panagariya that obviously Dr. Kim, from his penthouse, decided to jump down to join the 40%, and then probably has crashed all the way down to the bottom 1%. And that's why the ambulances are there. But I think this topic is extremely important because good trade policy is part of good policy packages, right? And that is the critical thing. And so I think the fact that it takes on Danny Roderick, who was our colleague here, incidentally, and before you came, and so he's sort of taken on himself to point out objections of different kinds, which I think he was taking on, and I think properly evaluating that. But in the background, you have to sort of keep this in mind, that this is part of a general set of reforms, being open. Only one thing I think we need to worry about. There's a difference between an open economy and opening an economy. When you open an economy, that transition path can be problematic, and you have to watch it, right? I mean, we learned that from people like Guillermo. And I think there are people who correctly argue, and they include us also, that transition paths are a different problem. You really have to be very careful about how you manage it. And this is different from once you've reached an openness, then of course, everything that he wrote kicks in. That's all I can think of to say. I hope it helped.
Well, thank you, Arvind. Thank you very much, Jagdish, for your wise remarks. While you were speaking, I was reminded of the Nobel Prize lecture by Hayek, 1974, and I have it in front of me. And there's a line here which is perfectly in line with what you said about doing econometrics without thinking much before you do the regressions. He says, I think maybe he heard you. It's some. He didn't quote. He says in one line, it sometimes almost seems as if the techniques of science were more easily learned than the thinking that shows us what the problems are and how to approach them. I think the lecture that we got today from Arvind took precisely that point of view and helped us a lot in framing the questions, and also realizing that that there are limits to our knowledge. So we can disagree forever, perhaps, but we have to narrow the range of disagreement as much as possible. That's what science can do, but uncertainty is always out there. We don't know. The reality is something that we can only imagine. So thank you so much for that. I will open up to a discussion from the floor. Let me bring at an issue that maybe you want to address eventually, and actually Jagdish has written about this, and it's something more, if you wish, topical, where we are now. I mean, going forward, still we are in the middle of a very big crisis, where financial issues are at the center. And of course, Jagdish has written about that. He has been critical about opening up to financial flows at a certain level, which is very interesting opinion coming from somebody who is so strong in favor of opening up real trade. So it would be very interesting to, if you care, to hear from you guys. How do you see now going forward? What are the challenges? I mean, is opening up to trade the number one challenge? What should developing countries be concerned about, and how those things can be coordinated in a productive way? But I don't want you to take time on that unless you really wish. I think this is time. We only have, we have about 20 minutes. That's good news for questions from the floor. So what I will do is to take several questions, and then after we have a critical number of those, I will let the speakers address them as they wish. Jan Sveiner. I guess so, because this is being taped.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. I think you've made it be so accessible that even those of us who are not specialists in trade could learn a lot. So that's terrific. So my question is more pursuing further some of what both of you, Jagdish and Arvind, said. In particular, so if there is a little bit more of theory relating to benefits of trade relative to level of GDP, right? And if there is over time reduction in protection, to what extent do the studies that exist can separate the effect, gradual effect on the level, which you could see like a first difference, right? So you sort of reduce it from 50% to 40%, there is some effect. Then the next 5 years you reduce from 40% to 30%, some effect. So it's an effect on rate of growth, but really it comes from the theoretical underpinning of the effect on the level. It's just proceeds over time as the level is reduced. So that would be interesting to know to what extent, in fact, we've been able to observe situations where we really can separate the effect on level from the effect on growth, or is that still something to be done, and if so, how? And then a little bit going beyond of what you've been able to show us here, and I know there are calculations behind that, you distinguish between studying things over time within a country, right? The times effect, the temporal studies, time series, and the cross sections. But really with the data that you have, one has what's called a panel data. You have for each country many observations. So one could use what econometricians call panel data analysis. And I'm just wondering whether in fact behind what you've been presenting, there is panel data analysis where one could, let's say, take into account fixed differences across countries and still see how liberalization affects all the countries, but exploiting the variation within country over time, but accounting for the fixed differences, let's say, across countries. Because that's going part of the way to answering the critics who are saying, critics methodologically, who are saying you're not able to identify completely. Now, it's not a fully randomized trial or experimental evidence, but it's going part of the way. So it'll be interesting to see to what extent that, in fact, has been done.
Thank you. I don't know if you want to address this. We wait. Okay. Please.
Oh,
If you could identify
I'm gonna hold it.
yourself, could you identify yourself?
oh, my name is Ari. I'm a first-year SIPA student. I'm from Indonesia, and thank you for the lecture. I've been reading the miracles and debacles of trade openness, and for me, what I really want to know is whether this impact of lowering trade barriers have different impact, as we see now that if we go further, separating the impact of this trade openness is actually what we see is the South-South greater protectionism, because actually after the crisis, we see a lot of emerging countries doing a lot of import restriction and import licensing that is actually have a strong South-South flavor. So actually the level of protectionism between North-South still low, but the level of protectionism between South-South relatively is greater. And facing this, we also have to complicate further with currency misalignment between the South, so they're afraid of each other's export, they're afraid of each other's import, and actually, if we're going forward, then the world trade will be dominated by South-South trade, but we see the GSTP that the South-South established in 1989 has never moved forward. Even in 2010, the Sao Paulo round is only being agreed by 11 countries out of 43 South members. So is this how will this affect growth with the South closing its gates to another South countries? Or is this actually part of the complementary measures that you talk on your policy package? So actually because they're doing export-led growth, so the complementary measure is like closing your gate from another South but opening it to the North. Is this part of the policy package? So is it viable for the South to still pursue miracles in time where export-led growth faced against another export-led growth economies? Thank you.
Identify yourself.
Yeah, my name is Jochen Weber. I work at psychology, so I'm more personally interested in this debate, which very much I would like to thank you for your contributions. I think that as far as I understood the opponents' arguments, their reasoning or motive might be that they want fairness, so that if you open trade, you might otherwise abuse people in these countries which would, for very low wages, initially at least, start producing for the world economy without actually gaining as much as if you were performing the same labor, let's say in the United States or in other developed countries. And so from their point of view, if these economies open up, then people there would work for much lower wages initially, at least. And it seems unfair. And the question is whether you think that so you said that the moral obligation would be to help those 40% rise to higher, to a better life standard. So obviously the motivation seems to be the same, some kind of overall improvement in standard of living for everybody. But I wonder if you make that a requirement such that you say whatever measures you take must already target or aim at fairness, then you might actually preclude that from happening. Because I think initially, indeed, you must allow some kind of unfairness for fairness to be reached eventually. So could you speak to that a little? Thank you.
Maybe let me. Shall I answer a few?
One last question, or you want to?
Let me just take up quickly.
Yeah, in the second round, please.
Okay. So level versus growth, Jan. Everything that is done on the gains, static gains from trade, as they are called, nothing shows more than you can go from. In most of these models, go from say 20-30% protection to free trade. Gains you have, the level gains are generally 1 to 2%, 3% maybe. There are ways to manipulate models where you could raise it to 5 or 6%, but that's a one-time gain. Right? So to me, it is ultimately the growth effects, largely. And if we were to actually try to persuade a lot of the countries on the level effect to liberalize, I don't think we'll be very successful. I mean, in the end, unless the politicians see that, over the next 10 years, I'm going to suddenly, instead of 3% per year, going to grow 8%, 9% a year. That is the kind of impact that allows the political mobilization to happen. So, and it is, I mean, so that I certainly think that looking at large number of these countries, which did grow rapidly, it is the growth effects in the end which largely dominate. So on that panel data, I have to look at, there is some studies there which do, but I don't know what the objections to those are or the critics, and I need to look at that. So that part is, I know that Anne Harrison and others have run some of these panel regressions, but still somehow the most compelling one seems to be still among the ones that I've seen is the Frankel and Rose, which use the instrumental variables instead. On south, north, I mean, I'm not quite sure I fully got the question, but I think I got it. I really don't see it this way. Ultimately, you want to trade based on your comparative advantage with whoever is willing to trade you. So whether the goods go to America or they go to Indonesia or they go to Brazil, it's not a big issue. I mean, in the end, you export where your comparative advantage takes. I won't worry too much about the direction. And when you start worrying about the direction, then you also begin to think in terms of liberalization as being discriminatory, that I will liberalize products where I can export to America, but I will not liberalize where I can export to Brazil. Or in the reverse, that if I'm going to get goods from China, then I don't want to liberalize. That's not the right way to do it. Much of the theory will tell you that liberalize regardless of where your goods are going to and where your imports are coming from. So that's how I would approach that. Fairness issue, maybe Jagdish, it's something you are the.
That's a very good question. I'm glad you're a psychologist, because what's happening is that just take the unions, which are worried about the effect of trade with poor countries on their own welfare. They'd like to tell a good story that they're interested in the welfare of the workers over there, that they're interested in altruism rather than self-interest. There's nothing wrong with self-interest. But they like to pretend, in my opinion, that it's really they're being altruistic, worrying about workers in my part of the world, putting on my Indian hat and so on. That is what upsets many people. And actually it's a psychological situation, because if you really say that in order to reconcile yourself to this situation over here, because you want to think about helping other workers, though your motivation is very different, which is to protect your own arse against this, then the nicest psychological solution is to say, well, trade is actually screwing these poor workers abroad, and that's why we are, altruistic and so on and so forth, whereas in fact we are really doing it for our own advantage. So this is why a lot of them, in my opinion, have come up with this view that it's really unfair, as what you use, to the workers abroad or to the poor people abroad to have trade. And I think in the end, they're going to need to go to a psychiatrist, because this is, they can't really properly hold such a view. It's just a way of defending your self-interest by pretending to be altruistic. So there are better ways of doing it. So actually people like us say that this is not a correct way to look at the problem. And actually you see the unions also behaving, unfortunately, in this way, because they do believe that trade with poor countries produces poor in the rich countries. So their constituencies is being compromised. they then, therefore, because they believe this, and they're only pretending to be altruistic, which is where they would come to you for help, but at the same time, you see it in their behavior also on trade expansion. Because right now there's something called transatlantic free trade area, where EU and US are going to get together, and if you want to think of it cynically, they're going to screw the rest of the world in tandem. You know, that's a gigantic, and I'm saying partly cynically, but there is some truth to it, but that's a different matter. The unions are supporting this because they want trade with what is called like wage, same wage countries. They don't think they're going to be hurt by the European work. We actually have better standards in terms of union rights and so on. So that's what they're not worried about. And so President Obama, who is really against trade generally because the AFL-CIO, etc. are against. So, but he, on transatlantic free trade area, he knows his constituents will not object. And so that's where he's going. And on on the Pacific Partnership, that's another story, but it can also be explained in that way. So he was against Doha round, which is multilateral, because that would have liberalized trade with a lot of developing countries as well. That's a no-no. So I think I would simply say that unfairness is partly a construct to reconcile yourself with it. And I think the book on India, when you look at it in some depth, it's the transformation of the economic policy towards greater use of markets. It's not libertarian, but it's greater use of markets. That we know now actually does pull people up into gainful employment. So the bottom 30%, which is what I used to work with when I was in the Planning Commission in the 60s, and that was pulling people above a poverty line, which you had settled on. And so in some cases it would be 20%, in another case 15, maybe 40. I don't know who gave Dr. Kim 40%. That seems a bit on the high side to me. But anyway, whatever you decide on, that is something, at least in the Indian case, finally growth, which was brought about partly by reducing autarky, partly by removing a whole lot of senseless intervention. Because once I said in a speech, which is I think I've put in the book, that the trouble with India and with many developing countries before the reforms was that Adam Smith's invisible hand was nowhere to be seen. There was just so much intervention everywhere. So we just dismantled it. It's not like deregulating here, which is what the Republicans are talking about. It was really unbelievable. Kafka would have been delighted to see it, as an example of what he was writing about. It really was crazy. You couldn't. None of us is a libertarian on this side, But so we went from what I call tell Joe, but it sort of doesn't even enter an ear and go out. But it's, people like Joe believe that we in reforms went from pragmatism to market fundamentalism. Whereas in fact, what has happened was that we had anti-market fundamentalism, and everything was, for interventions. From that, we went to some pragmatism in the center. So it's really, he gets it all wrong. And so does his friend George Soros, who is also, he accused a Swedish friend of mine, Leif Pagrotsky, who is a social democrat, when he was here for a conference. And I think both these guys, accused him, a really good social democrat in Sweden, of being a market fundamentalist. I think he got a little, traumatized, I think, for a Swede to be called a market fundamentalist. So I call it now the M word, like the L word. Fortunately, the L word has gone out for liberals. But so I think I'm glad you asked that question, because we really have to look at these claims to see what is actually underlying it psychologically. And then you guys will be, are the ones to do it. We can only give you our hypothesis about what's going on. But I really do think we should take the union leaders and send them to you when you graduate with your PhD, so that you can straighten them out a little bit, hopefully.
Yes, and there was someone over there. Please come up to the microphone.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Vaibhav from India. I'm from the PEPM program. Just want to raise one question. I mean, you clearly brought out the central role of trade in many of the emerging markets. But I mean, in the crisis, I mean, we saw that one of the immediate channels through which many of these emerging markets were hit was the trade channel, even before the other channels. But in terms of, I mean, all the talk of reforming the architecture and all the post-crisis, I mean, all the debates, they have not really focused on the trade aspect and from the institutional point of view. So do you think, I mean, something really needs to be addressed from that to kind of immunize these kind of countries from the side effects of this kind of a crisis from the trade perspective?
Okay, please. So we will have 2 more questions, including this one, and then we have to wind up. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Abubakar from PEPM program. Actually, the question I have has to do with the issue of threat, openness, and growth. We are not discounting the fact that there is positive correlation between openness and economic growth. But the main issue is, when will an economy liberalize? Because in as much as we cannot address this issue, then we may likely continue to have the same problem. Because what I realize is that many countries that liberalize early their current account end up having significant problems, more especially in developing African countries. But when you look at China, for instance, which happened to just join WTO in 2001, and China has been growing, but openness only accelerates the level of the growth of China, not necessarily the fact that China, without opening up, it cannot grow. It ensures that the critical minimum conditions for it to open up are on ground. But some economies in Africa, for instance, where most of the productive structure are not in place, if they open up, and if there is no any particular period or point at which an economy can open up and gain from trade, then we will continue to have these issues and will continue to debate about the relationship between openness and growth. So what I want to find out from the professor is that at what point state of economic development in that particular specific country will an economy open up and gain from economic growth? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, please, the last question. Please. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Ana Lehmann, a professor in Portugal and visiting Colombia right now. I would like to ask you about a related issue in this openness package, notably the importance of foreign direct investment and multinationals as related to trade and growth. What is, and I'd like to hear your views, the importance, and I'm going to put it very simply, of foreign multinationals as drivers of this trade growth in the sample of countries that you analyzed in this work? And related quick question is, in the last decade, we've observed also an exponential increase in outward investment from these especially large emerging economies. What are your views also on this phenomenon as also a driver of further growth in these countries? What is the importance that you ascribe to it? Thank you.
Okay, please.
So do you need to immunize? I would perhaps worry a bit about the capital account itself. I'll go slow on that in terms of opening up. I'll not compromise the trade account. I mean, you know, if first of all, if the capital account is not fully open, this was the case in India and China, and maybe to some degree Brazil. The countries actually were less impacted by what happened in the global financial crisis. Some trade impact did happen, but you recover very fast also. So I would not, rush to create some sort of mechanisms that, if you get hit, then you start putting trade barriers or something to, that's going the wrong way, actually, because your exports are going to be impacted adversely, and rather than rush to, close the market further, you want to keep them open. So I would not do too much there, actually. Occasionally that's a part of the cost. But most of these countries did recover reasonably fast. Second, on when is an economy ready? I think economies are ready. Because look, if one waits for this, and this is a very attractive argument always, that we are just not ready, and something. But why are you not ready? Ask yourself. Why are you not ready to liberalize? What you want to do is not maybe liberalize cold turkey, so you go from some 50% tariffs or something straight to free trade. You want to maybe go gradually and let some economic response happen as you liberalize progressively. But I would not wait. In the end, in most cases that we have seen, really, countries that do liberalize in the end up taking advantage of it. A lot of the African countries now, and one view is that currently Africa is the fastest growing continent. So, contrary to the way the question was posed, the economies that did open actually are doing a lot better now. So, gradualism, yes, and also.
In India also, you might add, it had on manufacturers an average tariff when we began 91 reforms, the big ones.
Oh yeah. These tariffs like 150%, 200% or something is crazy.
Now we have about 12%, but that took place from 91 gradually. So if we had shock therapy, anyone like a shock therapy should have been electrocuted itself. That would have been a crazy thing to do. You don't just go from that kind of protection immediately. The Prime Minister would have been justified if I recommended that, in saying that go back to Colombia. That's where you belong, not to policy making. So, it's a good question, I'm sorry. Yeah. I just thought you might be interested in the slowness of India.
Yeah. In most countries, actually, this has been a gradual. Countries that have done well. China also starts in 1980. It's still not fully liberal. It's not like China is free trade today. It's much more liberal than. So, it is spread. So, 3 decades, right? India is already 2 decades. So gradualism, yes, but I won't wait too long for these things. Get started. And you see, what happens is that when you get started, you discover that there are problems in other areas. You might find that infrastructure is, the response doesn't happen, let's say, of trade to opening up. Why is it not happening? You have to rethink. And so maybe the infrastructure is problematic. The goods cannot move from where they are being produced to where they have to be shipped. Or maybe the ports themselves are problems. So, you will then begin to see the problems, but unless you begin somewhere, you won't know. So I would begin to go. On FDI, outward investment, etc., and role of multinationals, at least much of the evidence I see, I'm not an expert, but much of the evidence I see, FDI has generally has gone hand in hand with trade growth, and generally done good. This is where I think, we at least like to make this distinction. And this goes back to the question that Professor Calvo actually initially raised, and we have not really come to address, which is, opening up of the capital account, as in financial capital. As far as the FDI and portfolio investment are concerned, generally, the evidence seems to point to being positive and going hand in hand with trade. Likewise, the outward investment also. So there are 2 ways to integrate in the through investment. One is to foreign investors coming into your market, and then your own market investors going into the world market. It's a part of overall integration into the global economy. Generally, in most countries where this has happened, the effects seem positive. I don't know particularly for outward investment, if somebody has actually looked at empirically what the impacts are. At least I've not seen anything. But my general sense is that that too is a part of integration to the global economy, which also generates gains. My little skepticism is more about the financial capital flows, and that goes back to Reza Calvo's question, the very first one. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much for a wonderful session. We will continue.